Welcome everyone to session 3 of the conference track Digital Transformation. This talk is on Artificial Intelligence 101, a guide for continuous improvement practitioner. And we have a speaker here, Dr. William Harvey. Dr. William Harvey is a manufacturing executive and a university professor with a deep expertise in continuous improvement, quality system, and leadership development. He holds a lot of certifications like ASQ certified manager of quality or organization excellence. And also he brings in more like 2 decades of experience leading high performing teams across the global settings, applying different lean techniques and Toyota Kata principles. He's passionate about developing people, advancing operational excellence, and also shaping the future of quality through education and mentorship. I'll give you a quick housekeeping rules. So this track is for 45 minutes in total. We'll address any questions you have at the end of the session, but please uh, be like open to write any Q&A when you're going through the session. And if you're unable to like answer any of your questions, we'll pick it up, we'll share with the speaker, and we'll get the answers posted into the conference website. Speaker William Harvey, the floor is yours. Please take on.
Thank you, Sundar, and welcome everybody at the ASQ Synergy for Success. Excited to be here today. I imagine some of you know me personally and excited you were able to join and share this with others. And for those I haven't had a chance to meet yet, excited to partner with you today on what I think is a wonderful journey. And if you heard me asking Sundar right before we started his ASQ journey, just as a comment, I get to work with our Cincinnati section in Ohio in the US. Phenomenal experience. So if you're not yet an ASQ member engaged in your local communities, it really does wonders from my skill building, my networking, and just making some really good friends. So if you're not doing that yet, highly encourage it. As we kick off today, Sundar mentioned this is AI 101, a guide for CI practitioners. And a little bit of background. Last year, I was at a different conference, and very quickly the room filled up, and we wanted to talk through how people are using CI. And it became quite clear to me during and immediately after that session that a lot of people don't know how to use it. And that's really where I want to start today is what have I been learning over these last couple of years and how do you use this in your professional practice? What I would share with you, if you're hesitant with AI, you're in the majority. There are quite a few folks that have never used it or have rarely used it. And then you have a few people like me who are using it multiple times a week, figuring out different ways to complete our tasks. And today that's what I want to walk through. But if I got into the very specific things at the beginning, it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. So I want to share with you today, I'm going to talk about 4 major things before we get into practical applications. So we're going to start with some of the basics, get into how AI works as I understand it, and then ultimately land on how you can use it to make your practice better. One thing to note here, I am not an AI expert. I don't have any training in AI, but what I've been doing is figuring out how to use it. And I've been fortunate to be born in a time where I've been using computers since my kindergarten year. So at this time, it's really a lot of learning through databases, logic, and some other things. So if you have that background, I think you'll find AI adoption easier. And if you don't have that background, no problem, because when we talk about point 3 here, natural language processing, you'll find very quickly that if you just talk to AI as if it's a person, you'll figure out what does and doesn't work. I mean, even after a couple of years of thinking I'm communicating well with AI, I realize I'm not. So I've learned over the years what works well for me and what doesn't based on the output that I have. And with that, I'd like to get started in this concept of what AI is and where our conversation is going to focus today. So anyone who claims to be an AI expert, I would question, only because there is so much to AI that you must really understand what they mean. AI seems and sounds new based on ChatGPT and some of the stuff that's been going on recently. But as you look on this left portion of the diagram, AI encompassing all what you see on this screen, like machine learning, deep learning, generative AI, and LLM, or large language model. And then GPT is lesser known, but it's a generative pre-trained transformer. So what this is going to do is go through different models like GPT-4 and ultimately what we get to see at the user interface level like a ChatGPT. And for full transparency, I've used ChatGPT primarily. There may be other models that work better for the work that you're doing, and that's worth exploring. But for me, ChatGPT has given me what I need to succeed in my work. We talk about these different terms. There are quite a few of them. What I'd like to do is just highlight 3 things in this conversation. If the slide deck is not yet available to you, happy to share it and propagate this throughout the ASQ world and beyond, just so people can use this really powerful technology. But I want to talk about deep learning and specifically this idea of a neural network. So let's get into that first. And what I can share with you is we've been using this idea of an input to output for quite some time. And there's some examples here, like a calculator or an early search engine, or even a spell checker. These are not what I'm really referring to when I say AI, because these are always the same input and the same output. It's programmatic, and it doesn't really do any thinking behind the system. It's just programmed to do exactly what you want it to do. But this input and output, I think, is a really helpful way to think about it. And as we get in this neural network, what you don't get to see is what's happening behind the scenes. So when you engage ChatGPT, you, the user, put something in, we'll call the input, and the output would be what you get to see and use for whatever your purposes are. But what you may not see is this hidden layer 1, and you may not see this hidden layer 2, and you may not see how it influences your outputs. But a really good example that I can share where you can get kind of confused based on how you prompt. If you're talking about President George Bush in the US, do you mean the son or the father? So the reason I've got all these arrows going different directions is because based on your input and how AI is interpreting your information, the output may be different. So you may need to specify 1990s, 1980s, 2000s to reference the hidden layer that you're really after in order to get the output you want. And to me, this has really been the journey in my AI experience, trying to figure out what's behind the scene so I can prompt better. You might hear from many others in the AI space that prompt engineering is what really makes this special for you, and I agree to that. What you've got to figure out is what are you trying to get out of it and what's the best way to prompt it. And unfortunately, I don't know your specific problems, so I can't give you perfect prompts. But what I plan to do today is walk through a few prompts toward the end of the session to at least get you started. And I'm hopeful after you get to see these, please do share feedback on what you found to make it better so I can use this for my work with my team. And if I get into this next concept I want to talk about with these generative pre-trained transformers, we get into this conversation, what does it mean to be trained? And that's where I want to talk about these 3 learning types. We can supervise the learning, it can just happen naturally, or we can reinforce it. And I think there's a few of these on here. These examples will seem very intuitive, but if I think about reinforcement learning, if anybody's got a robot vacuum, this is essentially where there's an input, it's trying to drive toward a space, it can't because there's something in the way. It will learn over time not to go that direction because it can't. That's a way in which we could use reinforcement learning. On the unsupervised learning, think about something like going to Netflix or your favorite social media site where it's giving you recommendations based on some algorithm. And it's trying to figure out if you like A and B and C, you probably like D because lots of other people do just the same. But that's really what's happening at that point. And then when you think about supervised learning, this data is where we're labeling the data and has very specific items. So if you've ever got a credit card fraud detection, that would be a really good example of supervised learning. And what's really important for me with learning is how are you training the AI in order to give it the output you want? So even if you said today, I want to go create my own GPT, you could. You've got to really figure out how do you want to train it? What data do you train it on? And if you get into the individual GPTs that people create, they're really creative and solve different problems for folks. And I think as you start to explore those, they're going to give you really good information, whether you're preparing for a certification exam through ASQ, or whether you're trying to solve a very specific work problem. The one thing I would share from a work perspective, please do check with your organization's IT policies because there's a lot of data you don't want getting out of your company. And as soon as you put this into the web, it does become a risk that it could be stolen. And the last thing I want to talk about from these terms is this idea of ChatGPT in a natural language. And when we talk about natural language, this is really what I want to share with you here. Imagine if you could teach a machine to write, to listen, to speak, but it's not just repeating the words back to you, for example, like a parrot, but understanding them. That's what NLP gets us. When you say, text mom, I'll be late, it somehow knows that mom is a certain name, and then that person can be or receive that text based on your prompt. Equally, you could say, good morning to Buenos Dias with a translator. And it's really a piece where I'd say it's not just code, it's learning how we think and communicate. And that's a really important piece with NLP. And one of my university courses, people ask, how do I engage AI? And quite simply, the answer that I gave them was just ask it as if you were asking me the instructor in this course. And very quickly, they could figure out what was and wasn't working. And they were astounded by how easy it was to get information out of it. And I'll share one caveat. I found that AI will make up stuff. And you'll hear this term AI hallucination. So one of the things to be really mindful of is always verify what's coming out of this system. So even though I'm going to show you some real life examples, do verify the data that's going into the system and coming out, because otherwise it will just make up information and perhaps lead you down the wrong path. And this is where I lead into what I think is probably one of the biggest risks with AI and the way that we use it. Just like me, I'm biased, and so are the people that develop this GPT technology and AI technology. So one of the things that you might be astounded by is that it can recognize faces on your smartphone. And I'm going to use this example. If we were to say these are cute cats, you'll notice these are all white fluffy cats. And this bias and the training gets to the point where I say, if you see an image that looks like this, it's a cat. Problem is, if I have a black fur cat or a hairless cat, it gets to the point it doesn't recognize that as a cat. And I think this is a really fundamental and important piece to understand. If we design bias in, we get bias results out. So when you're developing your AI, you must be mindful about how you're training it or where you're using it from within your organization. What inputs are going in, and can you make sure it doesn't retain that bias, or do you call it out directly with the way that you train your AI? And those are the first four things I would say that can get me into the basic understanding of bias state, or in the AI, but also the bias side. So if I think about the patterns that come up, and this is a good example for me, I love Toyota Kata, and I'll try to fit things there when maybe it doesn't fit. I love motivational interviewing, and sometimes I'll try to make things fit there where that may not be the best answer for folks. And then lastly, it does guess based on the wrong things because we didn't teach it very well. So be mindful as you go forward with how we train and limit our bias in AI. Otherwise, you could end up with some inaccurate results. And with that, I'm going to turn into some of the practical side. Some of these terms, quite familiar in your organization, I imagine. And the four that I want to highlight today are those ones in blue. We're going to talk about how you can use SPC and analysis, talk about how we can do some root cause analysis using AI, talk about creating fishbone diagrams in a really creative way in which I've found that it can work well for us. And then talking through standards, I put ISO, ANSI, and other here, but really what I want to talk about is how do you take something perhaps lesser known, like you switched industries, you have a new regulatory standard that's coming in that you just don't understand. I'll show you how we've been working with it at my organization. I do think I can do all the other stuff there, but for the sake of time, I do want to make sure I focus on these four big ones. So we talk about SPC. There's a lot of words here, and I don't mean for you to read them, but I do want to share with you how this prompt comes through and what can be an output to this data. But before I do that, I just would really ask you to imagine a time where you first got your first type of statistical analysis software. It was overwhelming. You didn't understand the menus. You're trying to figure out what chart you wanted. And maybe today you actually do understand that really, really well. At least in my company, we'll spend upwards of around $2,000 per account for some of the more fancy SPC and analysis software. But the reality is for me, I was probably only using 5 to 10% of what that software did for me. And I started questioning this idea. Can I use AI to do statistical process control and analysis? And the answer for me, I found, was yes, the way that I needed to use it. So through this series of prompts, it's listed in a set of steps. And as you use AI, any of them, you could list it in the steps like I have, or you could do one step at a time. And you can see in this example, I have if-then language, if it's applicable, if it's violated, clearly label. And what I'm trying to do there is to say, indicate to me what's important. And then I'll say I want a specific type of chart. I want it to be analyzed a certain way. For example, Western Electric rules. And then if I comment on process stability or capability, your organization might use CP or CPK. Those are opportunistic to add or take away as you need in your own analysis. What I see in the outputs, I thought were actually pretty incredible. So it took me a few iterations, but what I ended up with was something that looks like this. And what I would highlight is this data I made up. I intentionally made it shift on purpose for the purpose of this example. But you can see in that upper left chart, we have an XMR. I add a histogram, and we have an OQ plot. And in that observation, what we see is a distinct shift downward. And the moving range indicates a spike in range, meaning that we have some type of process disturbance. What I found really incredible about using this AI tool is it would quickly get me to where I should look. And if you're not using it to do SPC, a lot of this is left to interpretation. And as I asked that prompt earlier to give me more data, I asked it to say, where am I violating rules? And very quickly, it highlights where I've violated certain rules. If you're not familiar with those, you can find those even just asking AI, what are the Western Electric rules? And the implications are also listed. It doesn't necessarily tell me what to go after, what to solve for. And we'll talk about that in just a moment, about how we can brainstorm and problem solve. But at this point, I've taken something that's been more challenging to teach folks because I need multiple courses in statistics. I may need to teach them how to use the software. Albeit rather simple once you understand it, it's not so simple and intuitive once you get the technology. And the beautiful part for me is this is accessible to anyone who has access to the internet. So rather than keeping statistical analysis inside a technology that a few people have, this really involves everybody and engages everyone, whoever's willing to learn. And as a beautiful thing about this, just the same, it doesn't necessarily cost money to use this technology to do the work I'm talking about, other than the basics of your internet access in the computer. But as I get into more of this SPC piece, I talk about whether or not the process is stable. It repeats the idea that there is a significant change, and it talks about the capability in a certain way. And without going into too much detail, this last note for me is really helpful. The mean is too close to the lower spec limit, increasing the risk of defects. So as a quality professional, I look at that as saying, okay, well, how do I shift the mean to be more center of this spec, which is 80 to 100 in this scenario? And if I can do that, I end up getting to a much better spot for the process and ultimately teaching this to others in the organization. And with that, I've got this idea that if you've ever been in a brainstorming session and you want to use a fishbone diagram, what I've noticed is whenever I start with a blank whiteboard or a blank sheet of paper, I can draw those 6 M's or 6 P's that you see listed here. But what I find very quickly is we don't necessarily think of as much as we want. We get hung up with who is talking the most in this scenario. So I figured out this idea that maybe the better way is to start with a partially filled out fishbone diagram to engage the other senses, to engage other people, and perhaps even brainstorm. And I have this prompt listed the way that you see it. And I listed it, say, you know, and include 4 to 7 bullets per category. And as a very specific note, AI will do whatever you ask it. So if you say 4 to 7, it's going to likely go to 7, even though you say 4 to 7. So be very specific with what you're trying to create. And then you'll notice in my language here, my prompt, I say use clear and concise language. And then what I want to do with that personally is add it to a fishbone diagram later. And if you wanted to add these add asterisks or make it printable for team whiteboard use, you could do that just the same. I'm not going to get into it today, but the outputs of how you can have AI show up like an Excel document, a PowerPoint, an image, all those are very easy. And it's quite simple where you just say, put it in this output and it'll give you what you need. It's not always perfect, but it's one of those things that I think is developing quite fast, and I'm hopeful gets better and better over the near term. But this is an example of one that I had put in for excess weeds in the lawn. So just using a simple example, something that affects my lawn and maybe many of yours, is what are the 6 M's and how does it affect me getting excess weeds in my lawn? And while I'm not trying to solve the problem at this level, it really is a good way for me to start thinking about what are some of the methods? What are some of the human impacts to this process that I don't understand? And ultimately, what I see in here is a really good way to start a conversation with people and end up in a space where I can have a much more engaging initial conversation. And this fishbone diagram leads me to a really important next step, which is this idea of root cause analysis. So let's say we've selected an answer and we want to get into something. And for the sake of this conversation, I want to blame it on human error. And one of the things that in my journey I've struggled quite a bit for up until about 4 years ago was conducting human error root cause analysis. And some years ago, the United Kingdom Health, Safety, Environmental Group put this wonderful publication together. This is free and available for folks to download. You could either search reducing error and influencing behavior, or you can scan that QR code and save it later. But what's beautiful about this for me in human error root cause analysis, it goes much deeper than simply blaming the person. really trying to understand, okay, what human factors were involved in this decision. And as you read through this, you'll see a lot of information coming out of the chemical industry, which, at least for me, heavily influenced this output that you see. But what it does a wonderful job of is give me a new perspective of what, when I say human error, what type of human error and how do I solve that? So as much as I can, I've been sharing this with folks and encourage you to take a look at it and be happy to jump on a chat, talk about this in detail. That's not the purpose of today, though. I want to talk through this really lengthy prompt, but I'm not going to go through this level by one, but I provide it for you so you can use it in the future. So I'm going to talk about these major steps. I've listed, classify the human failure, analyze the job factors, assess individual capability, evaluate what organizational influences were there, reduce or review procedural integrity, and determine risk of recurrence and recommended controls. And you'll see within that there are a series of bullet points. Those bullet points can be incredibly helpful as I'm trying to define it the way that my organization does. I've used this prompt to say, start with the HSE guidance from the UK. And what I've asked us to do is determine whether the root cause is genuinely individual error or if systemic, what might it be? And ultimately, it becomes one of those conversations where we're trying to figure out where did human error apply, where did it not? And I know at least in my organization, everywhere I've been so far, we're really quick to default to the human error piece. I'm like, maybe so, but what type of human error and where might there be systemic level interactions? And one that is quite common for people to look through, and I use the Titanic as an example because I think many people on this call know of this system or know this failure well. And as you look back to the prompt I just gave it, the output looks like what you see here. And while I'm not trying to go through each of these, a few things I can talk about. What were the latent failures? What were the active failures? It is going to give me that differentiation, which is really helpful. And even without great knowledge of that document I just mentioned, there are 3 failure types they'll go through. Is it a violation? Is it a mistake? And what type of mistake is it? And within that, I can get to this point where saying, well, which of these do I really want to address? Or in many instances, which of all of these do I need to address and how do I address each of those? And I jump down to the end of this output purposefully. And in this case, it's saying it's a singular catastrophic case. It's a systemic pattern of maritime complacency, outdated safety norms, and resistance to regulation. And in the recommended corrective actions, perhaps you could go back through this and say, what laws did change following the Titanic incident? What about training and drills? Did we have some type of training that we needed to do for all crew and passengers? Is there a cultural shift in the way we were approaching maritime transit at the time? And ultimately, how do we prioritize emergency signaling over commercial traffic as part of that outcome? So I think these are those pieces where even if it doesn't have full awareness of your problem, it's going to give you some really good pieces to go after and things to consider. And I know for me, using this tool, it's really helped me clarify the language I wanted to share with others in the organization and get my thinking right before I shared it. And as I got into this process a little bit deeper on root cause analysis, what I found incredibly helpful was when I was trying to do my own root cause analysis, like where was I really looking? Was it a systemic issue? Was it a one-off issue? That was pretty straightforward. But then I got to go, well, what are the detection or the lack of detection issues I have? What are the specific causes? And what are the systemic causes that I need to address just the same to really get to that root cause and solve it for the good? My last practical application here is something around ISO, ANSI, and other. So I imagine if you're like me, you have the opportunity to deal with lots of familiar SOPs, documents, standards, etc. But every once in a while, we're going to get thrown a loop and we're going to go to a new organization or our customer's going to come with a new standard and we're not as familiar with it. And the standards I read have been anywhere from like say 20 pages to 100 pages. So it's going to take me a while to go through any one of those. It's going to take me even longer if I want to go between A and B and compare those. And what I ended up coming up with is this set of instructions you see here. At each company I've been part of that has document management control, they'll have some level of how an SOP should look. So in this example, I'm just giving one scenario where we have 12 sections. What I'm doing here is asking it to put it in a certain way that makes it easy to copy and paste over for me. And then I get into this series of prompts that talks about the procedure, the scope and basis, and the attachments and references. And I list, at least for me, something really important in my work is the safety compliance, the environmental compliance. So we do have the appropriate hazard communication out to folks. And then I put this these last 2 points I think are really important, right? As if this document will be reviewed during the audit or an audit, and the output would be in Microsoft Word. This helps me tremendously when I start to just brainstorm and I go back to the team and say, okay, I have this new standard. I'm not as familiar with it, but this is what it's telling me. You could go between two standards and just say, compare these two standards by loading them into the AI and just say where are their similarities and where there are differences. A lot of times what I see is there's more specific language in a certain area in standard 1 versus standard 2. And that helps me hone in on where are there differences that I might need to address in my organization. And if nothing else, it gives me really specific information to point to say, hey, this new standard says we need to do X. What does X look like at our organization, and take that forward? What ends up being a really cool thing for me anyway, in this Microsoft Word output, you can see the example. So I have the purpose, and in this case, I just talk about communicating chemical hazards. And I talk about the compliance with the standard. And then you can see as it goes further and further, it talks about what are those procedures that I have. And it may not be perfectly formatted for your organization, but it does give you a starting point, and you can obviously refine the prompt further to get it where you need to be. And one of the things that I found with AI to help with hallucination or to stop hallucination is to ask for references, ask for peer-reviewed information, refer back to the standard specifically. And when I do that, I find myself in a much better output that first, second, third iteration versus starting with something that just seems like it's made up the way that I understood the standard itself. So within these 4, they've been really instrumental in saving me time. And I was mentioning to Sundar and Jen right before this session started today that what I find fascinating about this technology is I had a task that I planned for 4 hours. Then it dawned on me, maybe I could use AI to do this. And while the focus of that specific prompt isn't in today's discussion, it took a 4-hour task, what I estimated down to about 20 minutes. In my opinion, it was better than what I would have done had I spent that full 4 hours working on it. And I think that's really the power of AI in the use for any quality and CI professional. So whether you're hesitant to get started or you love it, I'm hopeful these tips give you some confidence to start or some guidance to go further. And as I shared earlier, not an AI expert, but really finding a lot of value in my work, and I welcome that input back my way. And then this last bit I want to share with you, because I think this is actually a really fascinating part. So this is not so much a practical application in the grand CI sense, but I find that what I've been talking about are very input-output type of tasks. And what I found is I got a lot of adaptive problems that are always evolving. So I came up with this idea of using the 6 thinking hats, which is a book on creative thinking or lateral thinking. And one of my dear friends, Ryan, shared with me one day that he said his friend was using the clue characters to help create, not the clue characters, he's using these fictional characters to help create the idea and the way that people think. And I thought, man, it'd be really cool to use these clue characters just the same. And the way I was thinking about this was, how do you think about data? In this case, it's talking about the white hat in Edward de Bono's language. It's talking about think like Sherlock Holmes, think like Spock, think like Dr. Manhattan. And it goes through this cast of characters. And the way this left side of the prompt sets you up is just essentially saying, here's how it works. And on the right side, you see the prompt continued about what I'm trying to get out of it. So what I'll end up doing is putting a few scenarios into what my biggest problems are. And I'll ask it at that point to go through this series of rounds. I mentioned earlier in the session the importance of bias in AI, and I built a bias check into this personal wisdom circle. And what's been beautiful about this when I ran it through different scenarios, particularly if I'm doing a backwards view, like I had this problem, what should I consider? The idea of going through these 6 thinking hats has been really foundational for me and my understanding. I really excel in a couple of these hats. Others, I struggle to get into the hat and put it on. So for me, this is a really good way for Mrs. Peacock, the blue hat in this case, to help provide any missing input and give me a recommendation. You'll see at the end of my prompt here, I said, label every section clearly, use plain English, make it active voice, and avoid jargon. What I'm really trying to do is find this personal wisdom circle, this personal executive team, to get to a place in which I can say, I'm using this AI tool to become an expert level tool to help me go in the meetings more prepared for folks. And this is perhaps one of the more valuable things I've been able to figure out over these last few years, thanks to help with some really awesome friends like Ryan and others. And I'm hopeful it benefits you in your journey just the same. And as we look at today's topics, and really all of the Synergy for Success today, I think you're going to learn a lot of really cool stuff about how people are using AI. As I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of experts in AI. But when I think about the experts in AI, I got to be really mindful about where are you an expert? And as I go through this process, I'm really good with text. I'm not very good with images. So there's probably going to be somebody out there that's going to be able to benefit you much more greatly in that area. I use this for things like the professional side. I can do trip planning with it. So really finding some creative personal use is just the same. And then as I think about that natural language processing, just encourage you to engage AI as if it's a person in the room with you. Ask it questions. You'll see where you're struggling to clarify your communication. And that's really just part of learning how this AI system works, because it does try to fill in the gaps. And with these 4 practical applications, I'm hopeful they set you off into a better position for your AI or your CI journey using AI to be in a better spot. And I see there's quite a few things that come through the chat. So I see some comments there about loving the 6 thinking hats. So that has been one of my favorite things in the world to learn about. And I'm hopeful it provides some really good inspiration for you. And do want to share, I'm a few minutes early by design to get to questions and answers, because I think that's probably where we're going to spend a lot more of our conversation. But I do invite you to connect on LinkedIn. I am intimately fascinated with everybody's journey as they go through ASQ, as they propel forward the CI concept and industry, and have a lot of really good stuff out there that I'd like to engage you in and connect you with some of my network just the same. So you can find me there, or you can scan that QR code. And there was a question here about, Lena asks, as one of the first questions coming in, how do you input SPC type data in an LLM? So the way that I've been doing it, Elena, is to I don't randomize the data. The data comes in its current format, but I leave it unlabeled. And I'm leaving that unlabeled because we don't want to share specific information from my company. So I'll drop it in as an Excel file. I can drop it in as a table just using copy and paste. And very quickly I can do that. And in my prompt, as an example, what I'm sharing with the AI at that time is my upper spec limit is X, my lower spec limit is Y, and I want to see certain types of data come out of that. So you can use files, you can use direct text, whatever is easiest for you. I do find, for me at least, I just copy and paste more so than an Excel file. But if I have a massive amount of data, I could easily do that with an Excel file. So with that, Sundar, anything you'd like to share before you open up to Q&A?
I think it's a very helpful session. I learned a lot about AI, and I've like done a lot of certificates and courses on machine learning and AI. It's definitely helpful. I think we have few very good questions. We can go over that. I think the first question, right? Is there a bona fide way to ensure bias is not built into AI? Since everyone is, do we need to be consistently aware of the biases we have, and how do we balance it?
Excellent question. I'm going to go to LinkedIn for this one, I think, to answer it, because there's a real risk here. Bias is inherent to each of us. So to me, I think you need to be very mindful about how do you root out bias. And as a good example, LinkedIn recently started asking people about their opinions on certain topics. And as a simple example, if you were to say, what's the best problem-solving method possible? You might get answers like A3, 5Y, fishbone. And while none of the answers may be right or wrong, they certainly indicate a bias toward a certain thing. And at least with LinkedIn, people kept liking the thing they liked most, which didn't necessarily make the answer true. Problem with that is the next time you ask the question, it would be biased towards that learning. So what I've got to be really mindful of is, where am I getting the people to say that it works or it doesn't work? And as a good example today, I think those that are more affluent or wealthier are going to influence AI earlier in its adoption, because they're going to have access to the technology. So people without AI technology don't necessarily, or computer technology, don't have access to input. So I think we'd be very mindful about what is our approach to develop the bias. But I think it will always exist no matter how hard we try, but it doesn't mean we should stop trying.
That's good. So we have another question, which is, does the users need to be aware of the output and do evaluation, because those could be like very impactful? And is there any way, like how can we like understand the output and ensure the accuracy of it before the user go ahead and use the insights from the AI?
Yeah, so I'll answer this two ways. The first way is to actually use AI, not necessarily against each other, but to ask another AI system whether or not this makes any sense. And I mentioned earlier, my dear friend Ryan, he was the one that taught me this, was using Claude and Gemini, I want to say, two different technologies I didn't mention today. And he was having it do different analyses and comparing those results to one another. At least in his understanding and the way that I understood, I should say, was there was bias even in those results. And what essentially was doing was feeding or backfeeding those systems one another's data and have it compete basically to get the best answer. So I think there's that part that you can use technology to help you. And then if I think a very practical sense, does what I'm doing make sense based on my understanding of the problem? One of the things I have personal concern of is, does it limit our thinking? And specifically, how well do we critically think if we just simply trust the output? Quite a few times I found that AI has been wrong. And as a specific use case, I asked a question about a specific method and it gave me the wrong answer. And when I asked AI about it, it said, well, you asked, or I asked who created this model, and then it gave me who popularized this model. So very quickly, I could go with that information and just be dead wrong. So where I found the way for me to at least overcome that is say, cite your source, tell me more, show me more, cite peer-reviewed articles. And then a specific thing that's been helpful is, if it's not found in two or more locations, don't use it at all, because at that point, I've just got a single source of truth.
That's good. Since we have a few more minutes, I'll open up for another couple of questions. So I think one of the question is in the scenario where you showed SPC export or chart, right? Can we use AI to interpret the results? And the other question to this is most of the organizations have restriction on data being used on AI platform. Is there a private privacy setting you would suggest using for interpreting results from AI?
So from a privacy setting perspective, I think that's going to be based off of your preference. I'm very open and I don't put data that I wouldn't want shared publicly with anybody in AI. I would imagine if you were to ask my AI account, I'd look very dry, very professional, at least with what I'm asking, with a few, very few specific points. I think for organizations and individuals, you just must be aware that everything you put into the web can stay on the web. So from a use perspective, if it violates your personal ethics or your company's policies, don't put it into a system. And I don't remember the first part of the question. Sundar, could you repeat it?
The first part is, can we use the XBAR or chart to interpret the results using AI?
The answer is yes. I use the XBAR or XMR chart in here. And I think for any person, it's really just how do you like to see data? I just use that as one example. So if you have specific data in a certain format, just simply change the prompt to the report that you want to see output. I commonly use XMR because it captures quite a bit in the data that I review, but it's not a end all be all for that analysis. And that's really where I was saying the difference between, say, that technology, the 90 to 95% I wasn't using, I could use AI for, I imagine. I just haven't asked it yet.
So one last question, then we can close it. Can we apply AI for configuration management?
Can we apply what for?
AI for configuration management.
I don't get the configuration management. I don't get the C word. Sorry.
Configuration management.
Not understanding the question, so I apologize, Sundar.
So, can we use for configuration management?
I hear you asking the question. I don't understand the C word you're using.
Okay, got it. So then I think the next question is, did you use the AI to generate a 5-way fishbone diagram, or did you take the output and then put that into the graphical form?
Excellent question. I have struggled. I saw a chat come up here. It has been confusing and messy. I took an ASQ fishbone and just translated it over. I do not see all the outputs matching the way that I would want them to, but I have seen some success rather than creating an image. If I just say, put it in PowerPoint or put it in Word and list it in, say, bullet format. It may not be a perfect graphical representation of a fishbone, but I imagine at times somebody probably has figured it out. I just haven't figured it out personally. And at least for me, the way that I would use it is not necessarily to create it electronically. It's to create it, take it to the room, fill out the fishbone before the brainstorming session starts.
It's good. I think we covered major of the questions, and one recurring question is, do we have the slides after the presentation? And I know like we will have the slides posted into the website.
They will be available, and if for whatever reason you don't have access to them, I'm happy to share them. Just reach out to me on LinkedIn and I'll send them over to you.
That's good. I think that's all we have, like major questions. We can close off our session, I believe.
Yeah, I did see one scenario I want to comment on because I think this is actually really important when it comes to evidence. There was a person asked about information behind a paywall. There are many ways to get access to that file without necessarily paying. So I would just Google search it and you might find it that way. Equally, you could go in and just ask for that source somewhere. A lot of times there is a PDF available for folks. So I do say go back to the original research. Don't just trust that it read. So thank you.
Sure. Thank you, William Harvey. It's a very insightful session. I see like a lot of very good comments on the topic. We really appreciate your insights and all the prompts you shared with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sundar. Have a great day. And for everybody else, enjoy the rest of your Synergy for Success.